So we'll go ahead and get started here. So I'm Scott Glazer. I work at Salesforce. I'm in the IT department. I'm going to talk to you guys today a little bit about how we use AppCloud at Salesforce in the IT. My colleague Vamshi, he's been a little sick, so he might show up a little later. So I'm going to go through all the slides, probably myself. Also, this was meant to be a 40-minute session. I was told it was a 30, so I might go kind of quick through the slides. So if you have questions, come hit me up afterwards, and we'll talk more. So here's the forward-looking statement. I think you guys have seen this enough by now. So anything I say, don't use it as a solo way of doing purchases with Salesforce. So to start with a DevOps kind of idea of how to use Salesforce AppCloud, we start with a vision. And this is our vision here at Salesforce. So basically, we want to continually improve teams, make them more productive, get quality out, improve the quality, and get code out the door faster. So part of that is making a very collaborative culture. And I think if you guys have been here long enough, you've heard about Salesforce Ohana, which Mark talked about a couple times. So that's basically just getting our teams together. We also do that internally. So we do a really good job of trying to break down the walls, talk to one another, communicate well. We also practice social intelligence. So everybody talks about IQ. There's another thing called EQ, which is your social intelligence, how you interact with one another and behave. So we take classes on that internally at Salesforce, and we try to work that into our Salesforce Ohana. So now let's talk about the pipeline. So basically, doing DevOps is really about doing continuous delivery with that culture. At least that's our belief. So let's talk about what is a continuous delivery pipeline and how we use it here. So we start with our planning phase, and then I'll talk a little bit more about how we do that planning phase. Then after our planning phase, we get into the coding, and at every step along this pipeline, we get feedback. So as you progress down this pipeline from coding to building to deploying to testing and releasing, every phase gives you feedback. You want that instant feedback as soon as often as you can get it. And then, of course, monitoring. That's the last piece once it gets into production. And the other thing we've learned is that we do one pipeline per technology. So what do I mean by that? So right now we're talking about Apex, the AppCloud, but the AppCloud also includes Heroku. So you could do Ruby, you could do Java, you could do mobile apps, you can do all those things. We say do a different pipeline for each of those different technologies. Don't try to use the same pipeline. So we have a different pipeline. We do Java and Apex are the main two pipelines we do, and we have our technologies, so we have different pipelines for those. So here's more what I'm going to talk about today. I have more slides to talk about each one of these. So this is our transformation of using our Salesforce Ohana and culture and the pipeline together to do DevOps. So first thing we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides is how to organize your team, because that to me is like the foundation. That's how you get information in to start doing the pipeline, start your planning phase that I showed in that pipeline. Then we're going to talk about environments. I'm going to go over like how we use environments here at Salesforce, how we use Sandboxes, and we'll discuss that. I'm going to talk about how we use version control, so you guys can see how we do it internally at Salesforce. I'm going to talk about continuous integration, what engines we use for continuous integration. I'm going to talk a little about our test automation, what tools we have. We've open sourced some tools, so you guys can use them as well. And then I'm going to talk about how we gauge everything. That's that instant feedback I showed you. You always want to measure, have dashboards. I'll give you guys an example of a dashboard we use, so maybe it's something you guys could use back at your workplace. And then we're going to talk about continuous improvement. We developed a CD maturity model, which I'll explain at the end. Sorry, if you guys want pictures, I can let these up later. I'm sorry I'm going fast because I'm 10 minutes. I was cut 10 minutes here. So let's talk about organizing teams. So internally at Salesforce, we use Scrum. We name it ADM. So if I accidentally say ADM, that means Scrum. That's our own internal use of it. So a project consists of one or more Scrum teams. We average a size about 7 people, and we do sprints about every 2 weeks. Internally at Salesforce in IT, we have 250 engineers, so it's a fairly decent size and 50 teams. So you guys get an idea of how this works for this size of a development team. We also use a project playbook. In a project playbook, because we have over 50 teams and 250 engineers developing, we need to have like a template. So our template is like, here's how our project starts. And we have different types of projects. We have just your standard projects. We have enhancements, and then we have what we call KLO, which is keep the lights on, more of your support stuff. So those are the three types of things we have. And in our playbook describes how each one of those start. And again, I'm telling you this because that's the foundation of your DevOps. It's organize your teams, which is very important before you start getting into coding and testing and delivering and all that. So we use the Agile Accelerator. That's out on the App Exchange, so you guys can use it. Internally, we call it GUS. It's our Grand Unified System. It's a little bit more than what you guys are available with the Agile Accelerator. We also do bug tracking in it. So the Agile Accelerator is for doing your Scrum. So you guys can use that. It's out on the App Exchange. We store documents in Google Docs. So we're heavy users of Google Docs internal and Salesforce. We use a lot for communicating a lot of our documentation. For large projects, we use Smartsheets. I don't know if anybody uses Smartsheets, but that's the way we do tracking. So we track a lot of our projects through Smartsheets. And then we use Salesforce Chatter. So whenever we start a project, we start up a chatter channel for that project. And that's how we communicate within the team. So we try to stay away from email, and we use Chatter. What I haven't mentioned yet here either is that a lot of our internal continuous delivery pipeline also pushes things back into Chatter. So like when we have a test running, it will push information back into Chatter in that channel and say, hey, this test was running and it finished. And so there's a lot of chatter on our Chatter group. So, okay, so let's move into the sandboxes. So I'm sorry again if I'm moving fast, but I just want to make sure I get all the material down here. So here's how we do use sandboxes internally at Salesforce. Now, as everybody knows, there's multiple different types of sandboxes. There's your dev sandbox, there's your dev pro, config, only, partial, and full. I think that's all of them. We only use two. We only use config sandboxes and full sandboxes. So let me go back to this part. So we broke the areas up into different areas. So we have a dev area, test area, and UAT and prod. We call those swim lanes. That's just an internal name we use internally. But it's how we determine the stages as it goes along that pipeline. So let's make an assumption here. I have a project, and this project's taken 5 teams, team A through E. So here's how it works. So each team gets their own sandbox, and this is how we've done it internally. I've heard some of the other conversations where some of the teams or other companies have like one sandbox per developer. I'd love to have that. Even internally in Salesforce, we can't afford to do that. It's just a lot of overhead. So that would be ideal. So I would recommend if you could do one sandbox per developer, that'd be great. We can't do that, so we have one team per sandbox, dev sandbox. And again, remember our team size is 7, which is like about anywhere from 2 to 5 developers. So it's not too bad. They just have to coordinate when they use that one dev sandbox. So at that point, as they're developing, we have another config sandbox we use for integration. So the whole point is we want to integrate as soon as possible. So as developers are developing, we push it into that integration sandbox. And then we run some integration tests there, which I'll get to in a little bit what that is. After that, it kind of forks. And we go into now, it's in the test phase, in that test swim lane. And it's now from a config-only sandbox to a full sandbox. So now it's the replication of our production environment. So at that point, we do QA testing, which is more of the feature kind of testing, and then our performance testing. So at that point, and we break them out because when we do performance tests, we do heavy load testing and things like that. And we don't want that to be affected by the QA people going in and doing testing. Now, on occasion, we do an end-to-end. That's the one after the QE. You'll see an E2E, which is end-to-end testing. We only do that for large projects, and I put optional. The OPT on the bottom is optional. The reason why it's optional, for small projects, we don't need to do it. Large projects where there's a lot of integration and a lot of teams working together, we want to do one more step in QA before we go into UAT. And the end-to-end is more of a flow type testing, the scenario type testing, where QA is more of our feature type testing. So they don't do as thorough integration testing, so that's why we throw in that end-to-end on large projects. So after that, if everything passes, it goes into UAT, which again is a full sandbox. As you notice, the blue highlight around it is, remember, each team gets their own dev environment, and they have to maintain that. The blue area are the areas that are for project only. So every project gets those boxes. UAT, we only have one UAT, and then we have only one production. And those are restricted. So no developers, nobody other than specialized people have access to those two environments. So this is our flow. This is what we use internally at Salesforce and the sandboxes we use. So let me show you how we use that. So now let's go into the next step of how we do our branching. So I guess I'll go into branching, then I'll go into like our continuous delivery flow. So internally at Salesforce, we use GitHub. We use two. We use Perforce and Git and GitHub. I'm going to talk about the Git and GitHub because we're transferring off of Perforce. We have an internal enterprise version of GitHub, and that's where the git.someone@salesforce.com is up on the board there. And there's a line where it says git.someone@salesforce, and then local. So everybody knows that Git is a distributed version control system. So everything above that dotted blue line is on the server, and everything down below that is local to the developers. So I'm going to go through how we do our branching strategy. Okay, so we start with a master. Okay, and again, that's on the server. And then any developer can go in and do a checkout branch. And we do that for features, or we do that for hotfixes. It's no different. So we don't have, you'll see some teams have a special flow for for fixes and a different flow for features. We don't. It's all one. It's the same thing. Then a developer pulls it down from the server and pulls it down, does a pull, and does it to their local environment. Now, at that point, you might have more than one feature. So in our case, that's pretty much the case. So you might have multiple of those feature fixes. And also, if you looked on the previous slide, I talked about the dev environment and in the int environment. Well, here's where they come in. So at the dev environment is where the developers do their development. And then the int is when we do the actual feature branching. Now, every time there's a check-in from a developer, they actually do a push into the feature branch. We run CI. So that's where you see the CI. And you notice there's no CI on the dev boxes. We don't do the CI on it. We only do it on that feature branch. Okay? There's reasons for that I can get into a little bit later. Also, you notice we're also pulling from master. Now, normally in an ideal DevOps flow, you don't need to do that because these feature branches should be short-lived. Well, in our experience, that's not always the case. They end up living longer, so you want to make sure you stay in sync with master. So that's why our CI system will automatically pull from master and do some merging. So then if there is issues, we can resolve them as soon as possible. And that's that visibility we want to do early up front. Now, since I'm only showing you 2 of these feature branches, but typically for us, we'll get over 10 to 20 of these for one project, which is a lot. And ideally, we'd like to check it right into master. We found a lot of problems with that. So we said, all right, let's put a layer of abstraction in, and we have the project branch. Now, if you guys look at this, you'll notice, if anybody's familiar with the Git flow, if everybody's heard of Git flow you've seen on the internet, this is very similar. They call this like a release branch. We don't call it release, we call it a project branch because everything's integrating into a project. It's not the ideal way we'd like to do it, but this is what we're at right now. Because we have so many of those features and we want to integrate them when they depend on one another. So we wanted to have another round of testing, and that's in that QA box. So if you notice, I show the QA. So if you remember on the previous slide, that's where the QA comes in. And again, we do CI when they check into the project branch. Okay, once it's done, and it goes from the QA and it passes in the project branch, it goes to master. At that point, we say, hey, as development team, we're done. We've got the stories from our Scrum, we've done and we finished them, we did our coding, we did our testing, we feel like we've done everything we can to ship this project. Now, is it shippable? Could be. It's up to business to decide that. Normally, 99% of the time, we go through UAT. And you saw that on the previous slide. So this is where the UAT would come into play. If it passes UAT, we tag it, goes to production. Now, ideally, this is what we would like to do, and we do this for independent features. So really small features, we do just the single pull from master to a feature branch. And developers work on it. And you notice on the second one, there's no int environment either. So we've now eliminated the integration sandbox. This is where we'd like to go in the future. And we do this like for independent stuff. We'd like to do this for larger. So this would be, I would say, more the ideal flow that we're trying to get to. Okay, so now I've talked about the environments. I've talked about how we do our version control and our branching strategy. So let's talk about how we do continuous integration. So developers work. They work, I put here Eclipse, but it could be Sublime, could be whatever you guys use. We usually mainly use Sublime and Eclipse internally. And you do a commit to GitHub. From there, we run Jenkins. Jenkins is our CI box that we use. We use actually enterprise Jenkins from CloudBees. So we have an enterprise version from CloudBees. Now, I put the artifacts there because if we ever package anything that we need to go into AppExchange, we'll put it there. And the other one is Nexus. Nexus is an artifact repository. We use the same flow for our Java development. So for Java, we build jars and ears and wars and stuff, and we put it in Nexus. So that's what Nexus is for. We don't put anything Salesforce related yet, but there's things coming down the pipeline I can't say yet from the AppCloud that eventually there may be something coming allowing you to do packaging just like a jar, ear, or war. Not that I said that. So, okay. So then after that goes through Jenkins. So Jenkins is pulling GitHub, and I'll go into this a little bit more. We do some deployment and do those swim lanes I mentioned earlier a couple slides ago. There's the dev, test, UAT, and prod. Whoops, sorry. And then there's some tools, and I'm going to go into the tools on the next slide, but we have a bunch of tools. Depending on where you're at in that process, those are the tools we use. Some of these tools I've listed are open sourced, and I'll go over that at the end that you guys can use, and some we still have proprietary that we will open source later. Then in the end, we always check the status, and that was that feedback. At the very beginning, I showed you the pipeline, and every stage there's this feedback loop. So two things we use. One, on Jenkins itself, there we have a dashboard, and this shows us of every Jenkins job that's running for every stage along the way. And then for any of the environments we're at, we use Splunk. Splunk is another enterprise data mining tool, and that's where we pull a lot of our logging in. So that way we can see the status, and then we can go into Splunk, do queries, and then find problems that way. So just to give you guys an idea, here is an actual monitor at Salesforce in one of our buildings here in San Francisco at 350 Mission at one of the floors, and you can see at the very top, you see that Jenkins dashboard. That's it. That's what it is. And then below that is some of the metrics I'm going to get to in a minute. But we have this on every floor. People walk by. They can see, oh, everything's green. Hey, there's a red one. What's going on there? So then we can see that right away. So that's, again, that instant feedback we try to do. All right, so let me go through the pipeline flow in a little bit more detail and describe some of the tools we use. So as you know, we use Jenkins. So Jenkins is sitting monitoring check-ins. So say someone checks something in. Right from there, Jenkins says, oh, okay, I see that you checked something in. Let me run the job related to that. It's going to run some build deploy. And then once it deploys to that environment that we mentioned earlier, we run a couple of different types of tests. We run Apex unit tests, which Apex unit was a presentation that Vamsi, my partner, and I presented Tuesday, and I'll go over that at the end. That's an open source framework. And then we also run checkmarks. So checkmarks does our static scanning. We do for security scanning and static scanning of the code. Now, the reason why there's dot line is because we do that asynchronously, since checkmarks engine takes a while to go through the code and analyze it. Apex unit also does code coverage. As you guys know, to deploy into an org, you have to have code coverage. So we also, Apex unit does code coverage. So at that point, you get the results. Jenkins gets the results and says, okay, great. I see you got results. We have another tool called iPromote, which is the one in the middle. iPromote is our artificial intelligence. Think of it as like our own Einstein that you guys have been hearing about internally that we use. And what it does, it sits there and monitors Jenkins, and it monitors Gus. Now remember I said Gus is our Agile Accelerator. So think of it, it's monitoring Agile Accelerator, looking at all those stories. Gus also has our bugs, so it's monitoring all our bugs. iPromote's also monitoring Jenkins, so it's monitoring those three things and saying, okay, based on what I've gotten results and knowing everything that's going on, is this code ready to be deployed or promoted? And if it is, yes, okay, it met all the criteria, and I'll go over maybe a little bit more about iPromote at the end if I have time. That's a proprietary tool we have that we may open source later. But basically, think of it as an intelligent system, an AI system that goes and looks at your bugs, it looks at your stories, and it looks at your Jenkins results and determines, is this code ready to be promoted? So we kind of built some intelligence into taking out the human decision-making and does the code get ready to be promoted? If it is, okay, now we can go from that in stage into the QA perf stage, which I showed you earlier on. So if it says, okay, good, everything's promoted, we can go to that next phase. Then we run some more suite of tests. We run burp scan, which is our our dynamic scanning of the website to look for cross-site scripting, SQL injection, things like that. We run Commonium. Commonium is another proprietary tool we have. We will open source towards the end of this year. It's our wraparound Selenium, and it integrates with Sauce Labs. If anybody's familiar with Sauce Labs, Sauce Labs is a Selenium grid. That's a POS, and it's from the creator of Selenium, the guy who wrote Selenium. So that's Commonium, and that does your UI testing. And then we use Grinder. Grinder is that performance test. When I mentioned earlier when the code comes out of int and it goes to QA and our perf environment, well, this is where the automated performance testing runs, and we use Grinder. We also use JMeter, but Grinder is our big tool that we use. We have a big grid of load machines that run and get automatically kicked off and run. So that's all good. Results come in, goes back into Jenkins. iPromote's sitting there looking at it and says, okay, is it ready to be promoted? Let me check everything. If it is good, we go to UAT, which is the next step. And then also, Jenkins is in a really good spot to store all this results. And you might want to do some trending analysis, things later. So we pull all that data off and we put it in our own Hadoop system. So for later evaluation. So that's our pipeline. So that's it. That's kind of what we go through. And those are some of the tools that we use. And if you want to know more about that stuff, especially Apex Unit, I can talk a lot more about Apex Unit. Since it's already open sourced. And I'll show you guys at the end too, so you guys can contribute to that as well. All right, so let's go over some of the metrics. So we've gone through our environments. Okay, we've gone through the team, we've gone through the environments, we've gone through our branching strategy, we've gone through some of the flows and tools we use. So how do you measure everything? How do you know you're doing a good job? So these are the ones we use. So probably everybody's heard about more of the lean management and stuff, so we use cycle time and lead time. So at every stage along that pipe, we look for cycle time. How well is it performing? And how much time does it take to run something? And then we tie it all together, and how long does it take from beginning to end, which is our lead time. We look at change success rate. Every time code is changed, how often does that go through and fail? How oftentimes does it pass? So we look at those metrics. Next thing we look at is deploy success rate. So deploying, we always deploy, and you saw all the different environments we have. Every time we deploy, how successful are we doing that? If we're not very successful, that's something we want to know about. Those are things that we want to track. We also look at mean time to recover. So if we deployed something and it broke, how much time does it take us to get that back up and running? So we don't care about mean time between failure. We worry about mean time to recover. The last one, which I'll go into a little bit more depth in, is this maturity model that we have. We have a CD maturity index that we use. So we have a whole matrix of how we do that. So I think that's the next slide. No, not yet. Okay. So I'll get to that in the slide after this one. So I also want to talk about, now we have the metrics, how do we know when to release? And this is part of the things that iPromote looks at. So I'm going to talk a little about the guts of iPromote. So one thing it looks at is stories and sprint acceptance. So again, this is an Agile Accelerator. You guys can pull it down from AppExchange and use it. We defined our stories and our acceptance criteria. This is something iPromote goes in and looks at automatically because of the APIs that it uses. We look for a definition done. We define a definition done. We also look at requirements traceability. So I haven't heard many people talk about this yet. So basically, traceability starts with your stories Once you have your stories are built off of some requirements. So business comes says, hey, here's my requirements. From that, you have probably a product owner or a BSA that takes those requirements and turns them into stories for you. That's a traceability there. So we keep track of that. On top of that, whenever we create a story, we also track what tests get related to that story. So now you're building this chain of traceability. You have tests to stories to requirements. So, and we always track it around the stories because that's what iPromote can go and look at. So we look at no open sprint stories and things like that. So that's something you guys want to think about is maybe some requirements traceability. Obviously, all the code needs to get on master branch, which I showed their branching structure. That means it's gone through the pipeline. We also create run lists. So I don't know, people may call it playbook, people may call it something, whatever it is, what it takes to deploy into production. So we try to run our run lists. We create them at every time we do a deployment. Remember I talked earlier, I think the previous slide, we talked about deployment success rate. So that is heavily dependent on our run list. And our run list we need to improve because if you think of it, right now for us, it's basically a spreadsheet, which isn't good. It's like step 1, 2, 3, 4, down to whatever. I hope I didn't turn this off. There we go. So that's what that is. Obviously, we look at our tests. This is what's in Jenkins and the logs, which I showed in Splunk. So those are things we look at. And then, of course, iPromote also looks at our bug tracking system. So we don't want no P1 or P2 bugs, opens, closed at. And we also look at open versus closed. So we look at that as well. And again, this is majority of what I'm telling you here is all done by iPromote, the tool I told you about, our artificial intelligence way of figuring out how to do promotions. Okay, so I'm getting close to the end. Wow, I went fast. Holy smokes. Okay, so I guess I'll leave you guys a lot to talk about. So this is the last thing we've decided. So now that we have all this that I've explained to you, how do you know you're doing a good job? How do you really know how teams are doing? And when you have a new team come in, how do you help them get going faster? So these are kind of the questions I'm asking. How do you know you're continuously improving? How do you measure your effectiveness of your teams? How do you make it consistent across teams? Remember, we have 250 developers, so how do we make sure each of those teams, those 50-plus teams, are doing a good job? So we came up with this CD maturity matrix, which is I'm going to go into. So basically, we set up, these are the indexes I told you. This is one of the metrics we look at. So there's levels from level 1 to level 5, which is beginner to expert. And then we broke up continuous delivery into 4 different areas: building, deploying, testing, and reporting. So those are each of the different areas we look at. And from that, we build a bunch of criteria to meet each of those levels. So now when a team comes in and they start like an existing team or a new team, we'll go in and we'll assess the team and we'll say, oh, they're at level 2. Your goal is to get to level 3. But there may be another team that's at level 4. Your goal is to get to level 5. And this is how you do it. So this gives you a way to mature your teams, to help them get better at what they're doing. This is the continuous improvement part of it. So this is something we use internally. Right. So I'm not going to go through each of the different steps, but that's something that you guys could set up on your own, determine what's level 1, you could do as many levels as you want, but I just suggest you guys figure out a way to systematically go through and improve your teams. So this is actually my last slide. So I'm not going to go through every one of these, but basically these are just some guiding principles, things that we've learned and I've just talked about. I talked about, your Scrum practices. I talked about your version control. I talked about continuous integration. I talked about automation. One thing we also follow is anytime there's a failure, we stop and fix the failure. We don't want to continue on. I talked about visibility, tracking, and using the maturity model. So these are all of the things that I recommend that you guys could do. I believe that's it. Yes, it is. So that's all I had. So thanks all for coming. I know it's early, so I appreciate everybody coming here. If you have any questions, there's a mic right there. Is the mic on? Yes? Okay. So if you guys have questions, or you can hit me up afterwards, either way. Sure, go ahead.
When you're doing these continuous deployments, are you deploying everything? Are you doing like a deploy all, or are you having a smaller package that's more related to the development effort?
That's a great question. We actually started doing deploy everything. So a developer make a one-line code change, and then everything in that branch we would promote it or deploy it, which we found was a pain and wasn't really good. So we started doing partial deployments now. And actually, if I go back to the maturity model, that's one of our, let's see, where is it at? It's a level 4. It's in there somewhere on deployments. But we do have it in there, partial deployments. That is one of the things that we start following now. And we say it's okay if you don't do it. You're just not as mature. It's okay. Your team can do that, but let's get you there. And this is how we kind of say, okay, if you're at level 3 and level 4 is the partial deployment, let's help you get there. But that's a great question. Any other questions? Okay, well, great. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.